The card was cream-colored and embossed with a logo I recognized even before I picked it up. Alo, the restaurant that booked out 6 months in advance minimum, the one where chefs sent amuse-bouches glaze between courses and the tasting menu, cost more than my first-year law school textbooks combined. I'd been on the waitlist for 8 months with a friend from my articling days, half convinced the whole reservation system was an elaborate myth. This card had my name on it, handwritten, not printed. Table for 2 this Saturday, 7:30 p.m. No note, no sender. I worked on the 38th floor of the Sinclair building on Bay Street, in the in-house legal team of Sinclair Properties, one of the largest private real estate development firms in the country. My official title was Associate General Counsel. My unofficial title, as far as I could tell, was the person who caught problems before they became lawsuits and kept her mouth shut about the ones that already had. 14 months I'd been here. 14 months of arriving early, leaving late, drafting agreements in the careful language of someone who understood that every clause either protected something or didn't. Legal work is, at its core, anticipating the worst and finding the words to contain it. I was good at that. I'd had to be. I set the card on the corner of my desk and went back to the municipal zoning approval I was reviewing. 3 minutes later, I heard footsteps stop behind me. I didn't look up immediately. I knew the sound of those footsteps. Everyone on this floor did. "You're reviewing the Lakeshore file," said Beckett Sinclair, which was not a question. "The heritage designation exemption is weaker than the application suggests," I said. "The city's heritage officer flagged 3 comparable properties in the same ward in the last 2 years. If we go to the Conservation Review Board, we're looking at 18 months minimum." A pause. I could feel him looking at the card. "What's that?" "I'm not sure yet." Another pause, longer this time. "Alo doesn't take reservations less than 4 months out." "I know." He didn't say anything else. He walked into his office and the heavy door closed behind him, with a sound like a period at the end of a sentence. I thought about that sound for the rest of the afternoon. My name is Cora Thibodeau. I grew up in Sudbury, went to law school at Osgood, articled at a firm in Ottawa before deciding I was more interested in the business side of things than in billing by the 6-minute increment for the rest of my life. Sinclair Properties had been a gamble. The firm had a reputation that was, generously, complicated. But the work was real, the problems were interesting, and the compensation was the kind that let me eventually stop checking my bank balance before every grocery run. I was 28. I lived in a 1-bedroom in Cabotown that I was slowly making habitable. I had a coffee subscription, a library card I used aggressively, and a running habit I was constantly one cold February morning away from abandoning permanently. I mention all of this because I want you to understand exactly who I was before the Tuesday the card appeared. Not someone dramatic, not someone who invited attention or complications, someone who had decided after some years of the alternative that competence was its own kind of armor. Beckett Sinclair did not require competence of his employees. He required precision, he required discretion, and he required, above almost everything else, that you not waste his time. In 14 months, I had never wasted his time. The sender identified himself Wednesday morning, in the form of a coffee. Not a Tim's, an oat flat white from Pilot in a paper cup with my name written in handwriting I didn't recognize, left at the security desk with a note. "Hope you slept well. Looking forward to Saturday. FD." FD. I stood in the lobby holding the coffee and thinking carefully. Then I went upstairs, set it on my desk, and pulled up the Sinclair Properties Stakeholder Contact Database. Fletcher Dumont, CEO of Dumont Development, 45, third-generation real estate family, significant holdings in residential and commercial across Ontario and Quebec, and, I found this quickly, the primary competitor on the Bayview Corridor development tender that Sinclair Properties had won 3 years ago, in a process that had apparently ended badly enough that Dumont Development had filed a complaint with the BRB before quietly withdrawing it 6 months later. I was reading the brief on that complaint when Beckett appeared at my desk again. This was unusual. He was not a man who dropped by. "You didn't accept the reservation." "I haven't decided yet." You identified the sender. It wasn't a question. Fletcher Dumont, do you know him? The pause before his answer told me everything. I know of him. That's an interesting way to say yes. I closed the file on my screen and turned to face him. This was also unusual. I tended to speak to him while looking at work. It was easier. Should I be concerned? I'll handle it. Handle what exactly? A coffee and a dinner invitation? His jaw did something controlled. Come into my office. The next 20 minutes rearranged my understanding of the previous 3 months. Fletcher Dumont had been, according to the quiet and apparently extensive intelligence operation, Beckett ran through his head of security. A man named Soren, who wore his suits like he'd been born in them, attending the same 2 locations I frequented on a regular basis. The cafe on Queen, where I went Tuesday mornings. The climbing gym in Kensington, where I went twice a week. He'd been at the same charity reception I'd volunteered at in November, the one for affordable housing advocacy. He'd asked, at that reception, who I was. 3 different people had told him. He's been building a profile, Beckett said. He stood at the window with his back to me, hands in his pockets. Outside, the lake was flat and gray. It was February. Toronto in February looks like the city is waiting for permission to try again. For approximately 11 weeks. And you've known? Since January. You didn't tell me. No. I let that sit for a moment. Why? He turned from the window. I'd worked for him for 14 months, and I'd never seen him look like this. Not uncertain, exactly, but contained in a way that suggested effort. Like he was carrying something heavy and had decided not to put it down in front of me. Because telling you would have required explaining how I knew, he said, and explaining how I knew would have required admitting that I'd been aware of your routines long enough to notice a new variable. The air in the room changed. How long have you known my routines? I asked very carefully. A beat, long enough. I should have been angry. Part of me was. But there was something under the anger that I hadn't named yet. Something that had been there for months, I realized, quietly accumulating, waiting for a moment to become legible. He wants information about your operations, I said. That's what this is. That's what this has always been. He sat down across from me, elbows on the desk. Fletcher Dumont doesn't send coffee to women he finds attractive. He's not built that way. He sends coffee to people he thinks he can use. And you, he stopped. And I. You handle everything that crosses my desk that could theoretically be weaponized. Contract terms, site acquisition details, regulatory relationships. You know things that would have significant value to a competitor who's been trying to regain ground for 3 years. So I'm a target because of my access to you. Yes, a pause, I know how that sounds. It sounded like I'd been in danger for 11 weeks and hadn't known it. It sounded like the man sitting across from me had known and said nothing, and I wasn't entirely sure how to feel about either of those things. What do you want to do about it? I asked. I want to put you on administrative leave until this is managed. That's not what I meant, and it's not going to happen. His mouth did something very brief that almost looked like the beginning of a smile. No, I didn't think so. We built a plan that afternoon, Beckett and Soren and I, in the soundproofed boardroom on the 40th floor. I would respond to Fletcher's invitation. I would go to the Saturday dinner. I would let him believe his approach was working, that I was curious, flattered, perhaps a little restless in my current role. I would let him make his pitch. Soren would be 2 tables away. A small audio device, legal under Ontario's recording laws given that I'd be a party to the conversation, would capture everything. And if he makes an explicit offer, I asked. Then you have it on record, Soren said. He had the kind of face that gave nothing away, which I was beginning to understand was a job requirement in Beckett's world. And we take it from there. Meaning? He glanced at Beckett. Meaning we have options, Beckett said. I'd like those options to exist somewhere in the general vicinity of lawful, I said. Most of them do. Beckett. He met my eyes. 14 months of carefully maintained professional distance, and somehow this was the moment it collapsed. Just his name, just my voice saying it, and something between us shifted as visibly as a tectonic plate. Fletcher Dumont is going to lose this, he said quietly. I'll tell you how after you're not at risk. I went home that night and stood in my kitchen for a long time, looking at nothing. What I felt was complicated. Frighten, yes. The kind of low-grade fear that settles in your body when you realize you've been observed without your knowledge, that someone had been tracking your Tuesday coffees and your climbing sessions and your November charity evenings as inputs in a calculation you didn't know you were part of. But underneath the fear was something else. Something I'd been ignoring for months, with the disciplined determination of someone who knows a thought is dangerous and has decided not to have it. Beckett had noticed Fletcher noticing me, and before that, he'd noticed me, specifically, intentionally, in the way you notice things you've been paying attention to for a long time. I made tea I didn't drink, and went to bed, and lay there thinking about 14 months of careful professional distance, and wondered which one of us had been working harder to maintain it. Saturday came. The restaurant was everything the reservation card had implied: intimate, candlelit, the kind of quiet that costs money. Fletcher Dumont stood when I approached the table, and I understood immediately why his strategy worked on other people. He was handsome in a way that suggested he'd always been told so. Easy warmth, good suit, the particular confidence of someone who'd grown up expecting rooms to rearrange themselves around him. "Cora," he said, "I'm so glad you came." "I'm still deciding if I should have," I said, which made him laugh. It was a good performance of a laugh. He was good at the performance of a lot of things, I noticed over the next hour. The questions came gradually, carefully layered beneath conversation about the city's development landscape, the upcoming federal budget, a mutual acquaintance in the municipal planning office. He was building towards something. I knew the shape of it and let him build. "You must find it interesting," he said eventually, over the main course. "Working inside Sinclair's operation. From the outside, it's opaque. Most well-run companies are. Some would say deliberately so," he smiled. "The Bayview Corridor project, for instance. The RFP process was unusual." "I wasn't with the firm then." "No, but you've certainly seen the documentation since." His tone remained conversational, pleasant. The site acquisition strategy alone must have been educational. I set down my fork. "Fletcher, what are you actually asking me?" A shift in his expression. Beneath the charm, I saw what Beckett had described, someone doing arithmetic. "I'm asking whether you're satisfied," he said, "in your current role. Whether someone with your precision and your ability, and Cora, I've done my research, you are genuinely exceptional, is getting what she's worth." "And what's this worth? Your assessment of my market value?" "My assessment that information about Sinclair Properties' acquisition methodology in 3 specific development corridors is worth $120,000 to the right buyer." He let that settle. "And that the right person to provide it is someone who processes those contracts daily and has no particular loyalty to a man who, let's be honest, pays you about 40% of what you'd earn doing this at a Bay Street firm." Silence. I looked at him for a long moment. He looked back, confident. He thought the long pause was consideration. He thought the consideration was wavering. "Thank you for dinner," I said. "I'll think about what you've said." 3 days later, Fletcher Dumont received a call from a senior investigator at the Competition Bureau. The recorded conversation from Saturday evening, clear, unambiguous, explicit, had been forwarded through channels that Beckett described only as the right ones, and I chose not to ask for more specificity. I found out later that Fletcher had also received, simultaneously, notification that 2 of his firm's pending site plan applications in Vaughan had been referred back for secondary environmental review, and that a significant institutional lender had quietly declined to renew a credit facility they'd held for 6 years. These things were not, technically speaking, related to the Competition Bureau matter, but they communicated something efficiently. Beckett told me about it over coffee in his office on a Thursday afternoon, 3 weeks after the dinner. He told me methodically, the way he told me most things, efficiently, without decoration. When he finished, he looked at his cup. "There's something else," he said. I waited. "I want to address what I said 3 weeks ago about knowing your routines." You don't have to. I do. He set the cup down. You asked how long I'd known. Long enough was an honest answer, but not a complete one. He paused. I noticed you, specifically and deliberately, 6 weeks into your tenure here, not because of anything you did wrong, because of what you did right. I didn't speak. You caught a clause in the Thorncliffe Agreement that 2 senior lawyers had missed, he said. It was buried in Schedule 4, cross-referenced to a provincial regulation that had been amended 18 months earlier. You caught it at 11 at night, on a document that wasn't technically your assignment, and you left a note on my desk with the relevant section highlighted and a 2-sentence explanation. No signature. I had to ask Soren who'd been in the building that late. He stood, moving to the window. February had finally become March, and outside, the lake was starting to look like it meant it. You take your coffee with a precise amount of oat milk that you've apparently communicated to the building's 3rd-floor cafe so specifically that they make it without asking. You keep 3 colors of sticky notes on your monitor and rotate which color you use for different categories of document flags. You apologize before telling me I'm wrong, and then you tell me I'm wrong, without any particular hesitation. A pause. You wear the same gray coat every day, and I know exactly what it sounds like in the hallway, because you walk like someone who has somewhere to be. I was very still. So no, he said, turning to face me. It wasn't recent, and it wasn't professional, and I've spent 14 months deciding that the appropriate response to that was silence. His voice dropped. Fletcher Dumont sending you that coffee changed the calculation. For a long moment, the only sound was the city outside 40 stories below. Why did it change it, I asked. Because he was looking at you the way I've spent 14 months pretending not to, and the difference is that his intentions were. He stopped. His jaw worked. His intentions weren't yours. I stood up. I crossed the distance between us and kissed him the way you kiss someone when you have run out of patience for the slower version of this conversation. Directly, without apology, and with the full understanding that there was no walking it back. His response was not hesitation. When we broke apart, he was looking at me like I'd solved something he'd stopped believing was solvable. That was professionally inadvisable, he said. I'm aware. I'm your employer. There are power dynamics. Beckett. I held his gaze. I have been thinking about this since approximately month 4. I am a lawyer. I understand dynamics. And I am telling you clearly with full legal cognizance, I don't care. A sound escaped him that might, in another man, have been called a laugh. There were conditions. Of course there were conditions. I told him clearly, over dinner at my apartment that same week. Takeout from a Thai place on Gerrard, which felt like a more honest choice than anywhere he would have suggested. That I was not going to become less myself in the process of becoming something to him. That I would not be managed or handled or kept at a careful distance for my own protection. That if his first instinct in a crisis was to put me somewhere safe and figure the rest out without me, he needed to find a different first instinct. He listened. He didn't argue, which surprised me. I've been told I'm controlling, he said. You built an information operation to monitor your romantic interest without her knowledge. That tracks. I was protecting you. You were managing your own anxiety, I said. There's a difference, and I think you know it. One of his longer pauses, the kind that meant he was revising something. Fair, he said. I make my own decisions, including about risks, including about you. I pushed a container of pad CU toward him, and when things go wrong, because things will go wrong, I'm not naive. You tell me immediately, not eventually, not when it's manageable, immediately. That might require trusting you with things that are. Complicated? Yes, I know what I signed up for. I met his eyes across the table. I've been watching you operate for 14 months, Beckett. I know what this world is. I'm choosing to be in it anyway. That's a choice I get to make, not you. He looked at me for a long time. You're the most difficult person I've ever worked with, he said. I prefer precise. I know you do. And this time he did smile, real and slightly helpless, the smile of someone who had been outmaneuvered and found it a relief. All right, Cora, your terms. The Fletcher-Dumont matter resolved itself over the following 2 months in the way that such things apparently resolved when Beckett Sinclair was involved, thoroughly and in multiple directions simultaneously. None of it required anything dramatic or irreversible. It was simply the application of considerable leverage by someone who had been accumulating it for years, pointed at a man who had badly misjudged who he was dealing with. I asked Beckett once whether he felt uncomfortable with any of it. "He was going to use you to harm people I'm responsible for," he said, "and he chose to do it by exploiting someone who'd done nothing wrong." A pause. "No, I don't feel uncomfortable." I understood that. I didn't like the whole of it, but I understood it, and I'd decided that understanding something clearly was not the same as endorsing every corner of it. That distinction mattered to me. I needed it to matter to him, too. He was still learning that. I was willing to be the person who kept reminding him. What I liked less was the conversation he attempted 4 months later, on a Sunday morning in his condo in Yorkville, which was now, effectively, also mine, though we were both being somewhat indirect about that, when he sat across from me at the kitchen island and told me he thought things were moving too quickly, that my exposure as someone associated with him created risks he hadn't fully accounted for, that perhaps I should consider transitioning to a role at an external firm, arm's length, so that his complications didn't become mine. I looked at him over my coffee for a long time. "Are you trying to talk me out of this?" I asked. "I'm trying to protect." "Beckett," I set the cup down, "we have had this exact conversation. Do you remember what I said?" He looked at the counter. "You said I was managing my anxiety. And..." A long exhale, "and you were right. I was. I moved around the island until I was standing in front of him. I know what I know. I know what I've seen. I know you better than you're probably comfortable with, and I'm not running. So stop trying to build a compelling case for it." I took his face in my hands, tilted it up until he was looking at me directly. "Deal?" He looked at me with that expression I'd come to know over the past months. The one that meant something was happening that he hadn't planned for, and was reluctantly finding that he didn't want to undo. "Deal," he said quietly. We had made, between us, an arrangement that defied easy description. It was not simple, because he was not simple. There were things he carried that I was still learning to above. There were evenings when the world he lived in pressed close to its edges, and I had to decide, freshly, what I was willing to stand next to. Every time I decided the same way. Not because I was naive about who he was. Not because I'd been charmed into ignoring the parts that were complicated. But because I had watched him operate, up close, for long enough to understand the difference between a reputation and a person. And because the person was someone who had built something genuinely difficult, who held himself to standards that weren't always visible from the outside, who had spent 14 months watching me with careful attention and done absolutely nothing about it, because he believed I deserved better than the position it would put me in. He had been wrong about that last part. What I deserved was the choice. He was still learning to let people make their own choices. I was patient about it in a way I wouldn't have expected of myself, once. But patience is easier when you understand what someone is carrying and why. That was the part I hadn't anticipated, that understanding him would feel less like concession and more like clarity, that the closer I got to the actual shape of who he was, the less interested I became in the safer, simpler version of things I'd told myself I wanted. Some mornings I woke up in Yorkville and looked at the lake through the floor-to-ceiling windows, and thought about the person I'd been 14 months ago, arriving early and leaving late, and telling herself that competence was enough. That armor was the same thing as peace. It's not the same thing, I know that now. Peace is choosing someone difficult, and being chosen back and deciding together, every day, that the work of it is worth it. That's still what we're doing. I think that's what we'll keep doing. With conditions, with honesty, with the particular stubbornness of two people who have both spent too long pretending the distance was fine. It wasn't fine, it was just all we'd let ourselves have. Not anymore.